Okay, yeah, so I'm here with Dr. Rich Formica. He's a professor of nephrology and transplant medicine at Yale University in the United States. He's also coming off his presidency of the National Organ Transplant System in this country. So that's the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network. And so I'm here to talk with him today about a paper that he just authored in the Transplantation Journal about the value of the people who are managing and directing the OPTN. So do you want to talk a little bit about your role with OPTN and kind of what this means?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that the OPTN is made entirely of volunteers. It has for its entirety of its 40-year existence. Those volunteers come forward from all corners of the transplant ecosystem, so physicians, surgeons, coordinators, social workers, and most importantly, patients, donors, and donor families. So it's a pretty unique organization. And those donors contribute a lot of time. And I'll say that the paper that you referred to is actually authored by a group of us, and I'm just a participant. It's not my paper. But we sought to quantify how many hours these individuals contribute every year. And it came up to something, even after 20 years in the OPTN, I never imagined it was so much time, so much time. So it's about 400, during the calendar year of 2023 to 24, there was 459 individual volunteers filling 599 roles, right? So that means many people, about 100 people are doing more than one job. And they totaled up to over 42,000 hours. And that was a relatively conservative estimate. We sort of based on times in meetings and a finite amount of prep time for meetings. So it's probably over that number. And then we quantified the financial contribution to that by, most of these people are high functioning professionals. So, sort of calculating their hourly wage and basing it off the highest hourly wage for a federal employee, which is probably not what these individuals are actually making. And they came up to somewhere $4.5 million per year, which is notable because until recently, the entire federal contribution to the running the transplant system was only $6.5 million. So I thought that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, and so that's important to kind of remember that the value of the people that are spending their time, energy to kind of make a system work. Really, they're highly valuable people, and it's expertise, right?
Well, I think it also counters some significant misinformation there about the board being conflicted or members of the OPTN having conflicts. I mean, these are people who are volunteering their time, but it's more than volunteering their time. That's time that they're not having at work. It's time taken away from other potentially gainful employment opportunities, time away from their family, and frankly, it costs you money to participate in the OPTN, right? Because travel is not fully compensated. I was surprised during my presidency how many of the board members were using vacation time to travel for the board.
Yeah.
Right, so that's time they could have spent with their families, but they're traveling for the board, right? So, so it's pretty unique, and it's a pretty special thing.
If you could see any more research in this area, what would you like to see done?
In the area of volunteerism, or well, I think what would be really valuable would be somehow correlate that volunteer effort, not just to policies that are put out, but to transplants happening, life-saving, fewer deaths on the waiting list. Because I think that's probably the story that doesn't get told as much. Not sure how you do that, but that would be something that would be very valuable. I also think I think the government should really have a better appreciation of what they're getting for free. There's always this discussion of, as the OPTN, we couldn't accept in-kind contributions, like people wanting to donate, organizations wanting to donate their time to help us run the OPTN for some federal contracting rules, which I'm sure are in place for the right reasons. That's not allowable. And yet the volunteers are contributing this huge in-kind contribution to the federal government every year, right? And that's never been discussed. So I think we should get a little more foundational information around that.
That's fantastic information. So can you tell me a little bit about your OPTN presidency and some of your biggest challenges?
Well, so it was a unique year. As you know, you were there with us. So it was a challenging year because it was a year of transition. So we went from having one contractor, which is the way it was specified in the federal registration, and one contractor. There may be some criticisms of that approach, but it certainly made that ability to have a very fluid and dynamic environment, right? There was easy flow of communication back and forth. And the moment you split off the board from the rest of the OPTN and have separate contractors, it made information flow more difficult. We hired ourselves an executive director, and that person basically was thrown into the mix and had to sort of figure things out on the fly and sort of be that glue that went back and forth. But the environment created, even put limitations on what they could do to help facilitate that information flow back and forth. There was a lot of, in a normal year, there was some very significant events that happened that frankly needed the attention of the OPTN. They were very significant events. So trying to manage those events in addition to trying to manage the transition was a challenge. But I think the board in general rose to that occasion. And frankly, the volunteers actually really put up a lot more time in that environment. So I thought that was very rewarding to see.
And so we're here at the 2025 World Transplant Congress, and we hear a lot about other countries and how they run their transplant systems. And we often hear kind of that the United States is one of the best in the world. How does that feel being here representing some of that?
Well, I mean, I think every country has a system that works for them. So I don't think calling one the best is appropriate, right? Because what works in one country may not work in another country. But I was engaged in a conversation earlier this morning about, if you look in Canada, for example, Canada is a large geographic country. Population is smaller, of course, than the United States. But they run their transplant system based on their provinces, and each province has a slightly different, approach. And I think that's probably true of most countries, the way they run their system. And I think what we've lost track of in the United States is how unique we are. We have a nationalized system that covers 350 million people over a large geographic space. And although there's certainly things that can be improved, I think, by and large, once you're on a transplant list, and I'm not talking about access to a transplant list because that's a whole different discussion of disparity, but once you're on the transplant list, it is remarkable that how equitable it actually is. And people will look at the example of Steve Jobs and they'll say, oh, see how inequitable it is? He was able to fly to Tennessee to get a transplant. Well, the reality is he flew to Tennessee because his money couldn't buy him a transplant in Palo Alto because the system didn't allow that, right? So I think people lose a little bit of track of that.
And what is one thing you would tell the next generation of leaders that are coming into our space that may be looking in and seeing some challenges? What advice would you give them?
Well, you started that one way, which I'm going to take it one way, and then I'll give advice the second one. But I tell them to wake up and realize what the people that came before them built for them. And by that, I don't mean me. I mean the people that came before me. And we have a particularly unique system in this country that is run by professionals in the transplant community, and we have to take care of that. And if we don't take it seriously, it's going to be taken from us. And I think it's time to double down on that. And so my advice, particularly that I've been advising the new board members, is you need to remember your role, right? The OPTN's role, as specified in NOTA and the final rule, is policy development, policy oversight, oversight of transplant programs, et cetera. And the government's role is just oversight to the extent that we comply with NOTA and the final rule and governmental contracting. The government is not involved in the allocation of organs, nor should it be involved in the allocation of organs. NOTA was set up specifically to avoid that scenario. And I think we need to take that seriously and double down going into this time. And perhaps this change in chaos will actually be something good, because maybe it's going to make people realize what we have, and we're going to stop bickering over little things and stick to the bigger picture.
So Dr. Formica was telling us about this interim period with the OPTN and the leadership role that you were taking on. Can you tell us a little bit about how that worked with the multiple contractor environment and kind of explain?
Absolutely. So my role as the executive director, the interim executive director, was meant to be a bridge builder. There were all these different contractors that provided expertise, and there was no way to share that information with the committees, with the board of directors, and the executive director was meant to really be the bridge builder between these contractors and share the information so that the board will have the necessary insight to make decisions.
And so how did that work out?
It didn't work out according to plan. I will say that the multi-vendor contractors didn't have visibility into what the other contractors were doing. And for my own role, initially I did have an opportunity to meet with the different contractors, but as far as sharing information, that was halted because the government had a different idea of how they wanted to move that forward with managing the multi-vendor contractor environment, which led to the board of directors not having visibility into what was going on with this modernization effort.
Yeah, so this is, I'm glad she brought that up, because I don't think you gave yourself credit for the enormity of the task you were assigned, because, again, it goes back to historically what we used to do, right? So when the contract was awarded to the contractor and the contractor became the OPTN, not because it had to be, but the way we ran things, the CEO and executive director of the contractor was also the executive director of the OPTN, which on the one hand, I can understand the perceived conflicts of interest. I'm aware of that perception, but there was a reality to that, which was that person had total visibility and authority over the moving parts that was creating the OPTN's work products, like its policies, like its response to emergencies, like its oversight of transplant programs. And so you had one person who actually had visibility into the whole workings of the OPTN that could then facilitate the board and the committees to get their work done, right? When you bring in somebody from the outside who doesn't have that sort of oversight authority, and it's your lived experience, I think that creates real challenges. And then if you're hamstrung by not being allowed or given the authority or not being allowed to have the conversations you need to have, well, then we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve. And I think that's what we experienced. Even though we got a lot done, actually, if you actually look at this year, it was a productive year. But it's only because of hard work and effort of people.
So this leadership role, this executive function of the executive director of the OPTN, who makes the decision who that should be?
Well, so that's specified in the final rule, right? So the final rule states that the board of directors shall select the executive director of the OPTN.
So it's not a government employee, it's who...
No.
An independent executive director. So exactly to Dr. Formica's point, the board has final say based off of the final regulation.
But this is what the community needs to know. This is these unintended consequences of these ideas, right? So in the past, we'd select the executive director worked for the contractor would pay that person's salary, give them their HR, et cetera. When I was president of the OPTN last year, I didn't have a checkbook. But Rexanah can't work for free because she's got a family, right? So how am I going to pay her? How am I going to give her HR benefits? Who's going to buy her cell phone? Yeah, I mean, it's all this sort of stuff that we had to sort of work out on the fly and figure out how that got done, right? And frankly, it just recreates, with one exception of a creative way you can do like a lend-lease and have an employee that's your employee but paid for by another contractor. It basically recreated the same problem that we were trying to get away from. And I don't know if you experienced that about...
Yes. So to be very candid, it was interesting to go through the hiring process. The whole point was to have someone separate and an independent part from the legacy contractor, but being hired through a different contractor, some of the same issues you'd imagine would come up. But more importantly, because of the role that I had, having visibility into something as basic as finances took more time than it should have because the board didn't have direct insight. And neither did I. There was a lot of having to build the relationships, to build the trust, to get the information so that the board can make important decisions.
And many times, 5 or 6 times, whatever that was, I can specifically had to speak to the board support contractor and reiterate that Rexanah does not work for the board support contractor. Rexanah works for the OPTN. The board support contractor is providing HR services for us, right? I mean, that was an important distinction. And I'm not quite sure everybody actually bought into that or held to the spirit of that. But the irony of that is that's the spirit of what Congress intended it to do. And at the end of the day, it was the OPTN trying to do what Congress wanted us to do more than everybody else. And I thought that was kind of an interesting twist on this story.
Well, thank you both for your leadership. I mean, it's been a lot. What do you think the future holds for the role of the executive director of the OPTN? What should it be?
I'm going to add on to what Dr. Formica mentioned earlier on, which is this board now needs to remember its rights, its responsibilities, and its power. This is an independent decision-making board. They have the authority to steer the ship of how OPTN gets operated, not any other entity. The government, HHS, has oversight authority, but the board is responsible for the decision-making authority, especially because their fiduciary responsibilities tied to serving as a board of director member.
And you're an attorney, right? So your background's in advocacy and understanding those things. What type of experience and credentials do you think is important in someone who's going to take on a role like this?
So someone who understands how to read statute, the final rule, someone who knows how to read a financial statement, someone who knows how to get trust from the community. The OPTN cannot move separate and apart from the community that is volunteering its time to pour into the work. And someone who doesn't have ulterior motives to the work of OPTN.
And what are the motives of the OPTN? What is the mission of the OPTN at its heart to you?
To save lives, to ensure that more people can get the gift of life through transplantation.
And we did how many transplants in the United States last year?
Over 41,000, right?
Yeah, over 48,000.
Over 41,000
Yes.
kidney transplants.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. I'm a kidney person, so that's kidney centric. But yeah, so it's pretty remarkable. And I think the other thing that the executive director has to do is realize their fiduciary role is to the OPTN, right? And that can be, I think that poses challenges in this environment, because on the one hand, it means that person might have to be in a contradictory role to, or a contradictory position to the contractor, perhaps in a contradictory position to HRSA. And that person's going to have to navigate that, realizing that even though you can be on a different side of an argument, it doesn't mean you stop being effective and you try to get things done that's in the best interest of the patients who we serve, right? And you know, in the past, there were some very talented people that I thought worked within HRSA who totally got that and understood the role, which is not to always agree. You're not supposed to always agree in this position. It's supposed to be a dynamic discussion that goes back and forth.
There's fruitfulness in diversity of thought when it gets to the point of having solutions that actually work in reality and not just conceptually.
Is there anything else you guys want to add to tell the community about your experiences working in the United States and the national transplant system here?
Your thoughts are probably better than mine, because but seriously, because you came in from the outside,
Yeah.
You were immersed in it, you got to observe it, versus somebody like myself who's just sort of moved along through it, and my views are always colored by the past experiences.
So I will say, even with the challenges and the limitations that exist, the United States system of organ transplantation is still remarkable. We can still be this exemplar model of what can be done when different institutions and entities come together to do good things. Not that there is this sadness or negativity around, but really there is light and power when you can get more people to have organs transplanted and have more people invested and bought into this incredible system.
Well said, well said.
I could not add anything else.
Fantastic. All right, well, thank you both for being here. I appreciate your time and attention and the leadership that you both have displayed over the course of your tenure with the OPTN.
Thank you.
Thank you.